Here is what I know about dying. Nothing. I know nothing about dying, because I am not, I don't think, actually dead. Dead has a finality to it that I have always imagined would feel definitive, the way a door closing in an empty house feels definitive, the way the last word of a contract feels definitive when you know what you're reading. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like the moment between sleeping and waking when you're not sure which direction you're traveling, suspended in something that isn't quite darkness and isn't quite light, that has no temperature and no sound and no floor beneath my feet and yet somehow does not feel like falling. I am standing. I think I am standing. My hands are still raised. I noticed this first, the specific position they were in when the council's pressure hit, both of them slightly forward, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid the most important 3 words I have ever said in my entire life. I lower them slowly. The gesture feels enormous in the stillness, like the only movement in a universe that has forgotten motion is possible. Right, I say, to no one. To the in-between. To whatever this place is that is neither Prague nor death nor anything I have a legal framework for. Right. My voice comes back to me slightly wrong, not an echo exactly, more like the idea of an echo, like the space around me is recording the sound and considering what to do with it. I take stock the way I always take stock, methodically, without panic, starting with what I know. I know my name is Nadia Voss. I know I am 27 years old. I know I sold my soul at 17 in a hospital corridor and forgot about it for a decade. I know there is a celestial archive beneath Charles Bridge with buried documents the council doesn't want cited. I know an angel of death held a coffee cup he didn't need because I pushed it toward him and he understood what I meant by it. I know he has been carrying a thread of my name for 10 years like it was something worth the wait. I know I said 3 words in the dark before this place took me. I know he may not have heard them. That last one is the one I file under deal with later and move on. The in-between, as far as I can determine, is not nothing. It has texture, a quality of suspension, like being held in the moment just before a verdict is read, when everything that was true before is still technically true and everything that comes after hasn't happened yet. The light, if it can be called that, is sourceless and gray. Not the gray of the archive. Softer. The gray of dawn before the city remembers it exists. I start walking. There is ground here, or something that functions like ground. It holds my weight without sound, without sensation, the way dreams hold you when they're being generous. And then I hear it. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like the frequency beneath a voice, the thing that makes a cathedral sound like a cathedral when you stand inside it, the resonance of something vast existing in proximity to something small. A presence I would know anywhere now, after 23 days of having it occupy my living room and my armchair and the space behind my eyes when I was trying to think about other things. Azrael, I said. Not a question. Not a call. Just his name, placed into the in-between the way you place a hand against a wall in the dark to find out if it's solid. The frequency changed. Shifted. Moved in a direction I couldn't name but felt with absolute clarity, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, the way you feel someone turn to look at you from across a room before you've seen them do it. He could hear me. I don't know how I knew. I just knew, the way I knew my own handwriting on the contract, the way I knew my mother's voice in the first syllable before she said a word. Something that lived below the level of logic and above the level of instinct. The specific knowledge of a person who has been paying very close attention to another person for 23 days and has learned the precise shape of their presence the way you learn the precise shape of a word you've been translating so long it lives in your hands. I know you can hear me, I said, to the gray dawn light, to the sourceless suspension of this place. I don't know where I am. I don't know what this is. But I know you're on the other side of it, and I need you to hear the next thing I say very clearly. The frequency shifted again. Closer. Don't let them unmake you. My voice was steady. I was paying very close attention to keeping it that way. Whatever you're doing right now, whatever choice is in front of you, your existence is not a currency. Do you hear me? You do not spend yourself to fix this. We find another way. We have always found another way. Silence. The particular silence of something enormous listening. Also, I said, because I am who I am even in the in-between, I need you to know that wherever this place is it has terrible lighting and no coffee and I would very much like to leave. The frequency did the thing it had been doing since approximately day 3, the thing that was not amusement but was the shadow of what amusement looked like in a being who had witnessed the fall of empires and the silence after. I felt it the way you feel warmth from a fire you can't see. He was there. On the other side of whatever this was. He could hear me. And from the way the gray light shifted, fractionally, barely, the way ice shifts in early spring just before it gives, I understood something that should have terrified me and instead settled into my chest like the most solid thing I had felt since the darkness took me. He was coming. Not because the council would allow it. Not because the rules permitted it. Not because 30 days were still on the clock or because the contract had a clause that covered this or because any legal framework in any archive above or below the earth gave him permission. Because he had carried my name for 10 years and he was not finished. I stood in the in-between and breathed the gray dawn air and waited, the way you wait when you know something inevitable is coming and you have decided, completely and without reservation, that inevitable is exactly what you want. Outside, somewhere above this place, in a Prague apartment at 3 in the morning, something shattered. Not glass. Not wood. Not anything physical. Something older. Something that had held unbroken since the first death. He broke free. In the entire length of his existence, which had no meaningful beginning and had, until approximately 23 days ago, appeared to have no meaningful end, Azrael had never broken a direct council order. Not because he lacked the capacity. He understood this now, standing in the wreckage of the amber they had built around him, looking at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. The capacity had always been there, a door that existed inside him that he had simply never tried to open because opening it had never, in all the long unrolling of eternity, felt necessary. It felt necessary now. The council had not expected it. He could see that in the way they moved, not physically, they didn't move physically, but in the way their presence shifted, the vast atmospheric weight of them reconfiguring in something that was not quite surprise but was the celestial equivalent of it. The recalibration of entities that have never had to recalculate for this particular variable. The amber had been absolute. Constructed from the same authority that ordered the stars and closed the eyes of the dying and kept the machinery of existence turning in its correct direction. It had held every soul he had ever collected. It had held him without effort since the moment the council arrived in Nadia's apartment and he had simply accepted it, the way he had always accepted the constraints of the order, the way a river accepts the shape of its banks. Until he heard her voice. Not from outside the amber. From the in-between, from the place the council had taken her, which existed in the register just below the living world and just above whatever came after, a waiting room for souls under administrative review. Her voice had come through the amber the way her presence had always come through every constraint he had ever tried to build around his awareness of her, completely, without asking permission, as if walls were simply a suggestion she had chosen not to follow. Don't let them unmake you. He had stood inside the amber and listened to her tell him his existence was not a currency. He had felt the thing that was not amusement move through him when she complained about the lighting. And then he had listened to the silence after, the particular silence of Nadia Voss deciding something with her whole self, and felt the amber simply stop being relevant. It didn't shatter dramatically. That is not how these things work, not at this level, not with forces this old. It came apart the way certainty comes apart when something more true arrives to replace it, quietly, completely, without the possibility of reconstruction. The council reacted immediately. Collector. The central figure's voice carried the specific weight of an authority that had never before been required to repeat itself. You will stand down. No, said Azrael. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, small, precise, and sending disruptions outward in every direction. In the entire length of his existence he had never said it to the council. Not once. The absence of that word had been so complete that its presence now felt seismic, felt like the first crack in a foundation that had been laid before the first human being drew breath. You understand what you are doing, said the council. Not a question. Yes, he said. He was already moving toward the place in the apartment's atmosphere where the in-between pressed closest against the living world, a membrane, thin as intention, that the council had sealed when they took her. I understand precisely what I am doing. I have understood it since day one. I simply chose, until now, to work within the framework. The framework has stopped being adequate. The consequences. I know the consequences. He turned to face them fully, all five, their vast presence filling the apartment with the weight of institutional authority accumulated over millennia. I have administered consequences. I know exactly what they look like from every angle. He paused. I am choosing this anyway. The central figure regarded him with the flat attention of something that had never had to account for this variable and was now doing so with the cold efficiency of a system rerouting around an obstacle. You would unmake yourself for a human soul. I would unmake myself, he said carefully, for this human soul. The distinction is not semantic. He pressed one hand against the membrane. It resisted, of course it resisted. The council had sealed it with the full weight of celestial authority, and that authority was not nothing, had never been nothing, was in fact the architecture upon which the entire functioning of existence depended. He felt it push back against his palm like pressure against a wound. He pushed harder. The cost began immediately, the way he had known it would, not pain, because pain is a human mechanism and he had never been fully human, but something adjacent to it. A loosening. A sense of threads pulling free from the weave of his being, the celestial equivalent of blood loss, slow and steady and measurable. The council was not stopping him directly, he understood why. Stopping him directly would require an engagement they were not prepared for. Instead, they were allowing the cost to accumulate, waiting for it to become prohibitive. They did not know, could not have accounted for, the specific quality of his stubbornness when it finally, after thousands of years, had something to be stubborn about. Azrael. The council's voice dropped into a register he had never heard from them, something beneath authority, something almost careful. What she said to you. In the darkness. You understand it cannot change the fundamental nature of what you are and what she is. His hand was still on the membrane. The loosening continued, steady and significant. I understand, he said, that it already has. He closed his eyes. He thought of a coffee cup pushed across a counter. A research wall covered in notes at midnight. Dark green eyes that went soft for 40 minutes on a Sunday phone call and sharp again the moment she hung up, the armor back in place before she turned around, not knowing he had watched the whole transition and filed it somewhere that was not a filing system, somewhere older and less organized and considerably more dangerous. He thought of her hands pressed flat against his chest. The weight of them. The specific warmth of a human being choosing, deliberately and without reservation, to touch something that could have unmade her. He thought of 3 words said in darkness, aimed at him, uncertain of their destination. He pushed through the membrane. The in-between opened around him like a held breath released, gray dawn light, sourceless and soft, and the absence of temperature, and the particular quality of suspension that meant this place had been holding something precious and was now, finally, being asked to give it back. He was standing in the in-between. Across the gray distance, not far, because distance here operated differently than distance in the living world. A young woman with dark brown hair and sharp dark green eyes stood with her arms slightly lowered and her chin raised and the expression on her face that she wore when she had decided something completely and was simply waiting for reality to catch up. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You broke free," she said. Not surprise. The specific tone of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed. "Yes," he said. "They're going to punish you for that." "Yes." "How bad?" He considered lying. He had never lied, not once in all of existence, because what would be the point, because he was the end of things and the end of things has no use for misdirection. He considered it now for approximately 1 second, because she was looking at him with those sharp eyes that had been reading him accurately since day 3, and he understood that lying to Nadia Voss was not only pointless but actively counterproductive. "Bad," he said. She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened, the specific tightening that meant she was processing something she didn't like and refusing to let it show beyond that one small tell. "Okay," she said. "Then we fix it before they can start." "Nadia." I said okay, not I accept it. She was already looking around the in-between with the focused attention of someone arriving in a new city and immediately beginning to map the exits. There is a way out of this that doesn't cost you everything. There is always a clause. I just need to find it. He stood in the gray dawn light of the in-between and looked at her, this impossible, infuriating, extraordinary human being who had been handed the worst situation of her life and responded by doing research, and felt the loosening from breaking through the membrane settle into something that didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt, with a precision that required no translation, like the only thing he had done in thousands of years that was entirely, unconditionally right. "Then let's find it," he said. Her eyes met his. And for the first time since the darkness took her, since the council's pressure hit and the lights went out and she said 3 words into the black, she let herself look at him the way she had been carefully not looking at him since approximately day 6. Fully. Without the armor. "Together," she said. "Together," he said. The in-between held them both, gray and soft and ancient, and outside its membrane the council recalibrated in silence, and the cost continued to accumulate, and none of it, not one measure of it, was enough to make either of them take a single step back. The in-between had geography. This was the first thing I established, because establishing things, categorizing them, mapping them, giving them names and dimensions, is how I function when the alternative is standing still and feeling everything I am not ready to feel. It wasn't large, exactly. It wasn't small. It existed in the way the archive had existed, outside the measurements that should have contained it, obeying its own internal logic rather than anything a human architect would recognize. The gray dawn light came from everywhere and nowhere. The ground held without texture. The air moved without wind. It was, I decided, the physical manifestation of a bureaucratic holding pattern, which was almost funny, given that I spent my professional life translating documents for people trapped in bureaucratic holding patterns. Almost. Azrael walked beside me. Closer than he had allowed himself in the apartment, where there had always been the furniture of normalcy between us, the coffee cups and the research papers and the careful maintenance of a distance that neither of us had formally agreed to, but both of us had been keeping with the specific diligence of people who understand that some distances exist for very good reasons. Here there was no furniture. No distance maintained by mutual unspoken agreement. Just the gray light and the suspended air and the two of us moving through it together, and the thing I had been carefully not examining since approximately day 6 sitting between us with the patient permanence of something that had decided it was done being ignored. The thread, I said, because thinking about the thread was safer than thinking about the other thing. The one you've been carrying. Can I feel it from this side? He was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? You said every soul under contract exists in your awareness as a thread. You've had mine for 10 years. I kept my eyes forward, on the gray middle distance. I'm asking if it works both ways. If I can feel you the way you've been feeling me. Another pause. Longer. It is not designed to work both ways, he said carefully. That wasn't what I asked. The pause that followed had the particular quality of a being who has spent thousands of years choosing words with extreme precision, encountering a question that his precision cannot adequately navigate. In the in-between, he said finally, the membrane between a soul and its collector is thinner than in the living world. The directionality of the connection becomes less fixed. So yes, I said. Yes. I stopped walking. He stopped beside me, and I turned to look at him fully, the way I had let myself look at him at the end, before the darkness came, the way I was apparently doing again now because the armor had been dismantled by circumstance and I hadn't had time to rebuild it, and some part of me was no longer entirely sure I wanted to. Show me, I said. Nadia. Show me what you've been carrying. For 10 years. I want to know what my thread feels like from your side. He looked at me for a long moment with those iron gray eyes that had been getting progressively warmer since approximately day 4 and were now, in the gray light of the in-between, something I could only describe as devastating. Then he raised one hand, slowly, with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. The deliberateness of a being who understood that small gestures in the proximity of significant things could have enormous consequences, and held it between us, palm up. In his palm, visible in a way that shouldn't have been possible but felt entirely inevitable, was a thread of light. Not gold, not the warm obvious gold of something precious and valued. Something quieter. The color of a window at night when someone inside has left a lamp on, amber at the edges, steady at the center, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. My breath did something I didn't authorize. That's me, I said. That's you, he said. It's been that bright the whole time? He didn't answer. Which was an answer. Which meant it had been, which meant for 10 years, among however many millions of threads he carried in his awareness, mine had been. I filed this under deal with later and then immediately unfiled it because later was not going to be available at this rate and I was tired of filing things. When the council took me, I said carefully. When the darkness came. Could you still feel it? Yes, he said. The word came out with a weight that told me exactly what those moments had been like from his side of the membrane, the amber holding him immobile, the thread still present in his awareness, burning steadily while the council informed him of consequences he had already decided to accept. I reached out and touched the thread. The sensation was, there is no adequate translation. Every language I work in has words for connection and words for recognition and words for the specific feeling of something falling into place that you hadn't realized was out of place until it landed. But none of them are sufficient for what passed through my hand when I touched the light in his palm. It was 10 years of being known from a distance. 10 years of a presence I hadn't been able to feel, but that had been there regardless, steady and specific and entirely focused on the particular shape of who I was. It was the coffee cup. The archive. The descent written a century before I was born. It was every moment he had turned away to give me privacy, and every moment he had watched me with that layered attention, and every moment the composure had cracked and something real had come through in the fraction of a second before he rebuilt it. My eyes did the thing I didn't authorize again. I let them this time. 10 years, I said. Yes, he said. That's Azrael, that's a long time to carry something alone. I am aware, he said softly. Is that why you wrote The Descent? I looked up at him. In 1887. Was it, had you already started to understand that this wasn't, that carrying all of them alone wasn't? The Descent, he said slowly, was written because I believed it was legally correct. That is what I told myself at the time. A pause, the specific pause of someone reading their own history with the uncomfortable clarity of retrospect. I have had considerable time to reconsider what I told myself at the time. I looked at him in the gray light. He looked back. What do you actually think it was? I asked. I think, he said, with the careful precision of someone dismantling a wall they built themselves and examining each brick as it comes down, that I had carried enough endings to understand what was being lost in each one. And I think that understanding had accumulated, over a very long time, into something that needed to go somewhere. The descent was where it went. And then 10 years ago, I said, my thread arrived. And then 10 years ago, he said, your thread arrived. And it was not like the others. From the first moment. I told myself it was an anomaly. A statistical variation. I catalogued it as such and continued. He paused. I was not being honest with myself. No, I agreed softly. You weren't. The thread in his palm pulsed once, warm and steady, and I realized I could feel it from my side now too, a faint warmth in my own chest, the specific sensation of a connection that had been running in one direction for 10 years finally acknowledging the return signal. Then he said it. Quietly, without preamble, with the directness of a being who had chosen honesty over self-protection every time and was not about to stop now. What you said, he said. In the darkness. Before the council took you. His eyes held mine with an absolute steadiness. I heard it. The in-between was very quiet. All 3 words? I asked. My voice was steady. I was paying extremely close attention to keeping it that way. All 3 words, he said. I looked at him. He looked at me. The thread pulsed between us in the gray light, 10 years of one-directional warmth finally, irrevocably, flowing both ways. Good, I said. And my voice only broke on that one word, just slightly, just once, and I let it because some things are too true for a steady voice. He reached out, slowly, with that devastating deliberateness, and his hand covered mine where it still rested against the thread in his palm. The same gesture as Act 7, the same placement, but different in every way that mattered because this time nothing was pressing in from the edges and the council was on the other side of a membrane he had broken through by choice, and we were standing in the in-between together because he had decided, after thousands of years of carrying things alone, that this was the thing worth breaking for. We should keep moving, he said. He didn't let go of my hand. We should, I agreed. I didn't pull it away. We walked through the gray light of the in-between, and the thread ran warm between us, and ahead somewhere in the suspension of this place was the older law I had not found yet but was absolutely going to find, because I translated for a living and I knew how to read far enough, and behind us the council recalibrated in silence, and the cost continued accumulating in Azrael's being like a tide coming in, and neither of us talked about that last part yet because we were both, in our different ways, people who dealt with one catastrophe at a time. The second catastrophe was coming. We both knew it. For now there was the gray light and the thread and his hand in mine and the specific, fragile, extraordinary fact that we were here at all. It was enough. For now, it was exactly enough. The council spoke through the membrane. I had not known this was possible, that their voice could reach into the in-between, that the barrier Azrael had broken through was permeable in that direction even if it had cost him everything to breach it in the other. But their presence arrived like weather, like the pressure drop before a storm, settling into the gray light of the in-between with the flat inevitability of something that had never once in its existence been successfully ignored. Collector. The central figure's voice came from everywhere at once, sourceless and immense and utterly without warmth. You have 24 hours before the unmaking begins in full. We are extending this courtesy because it has not been done before and the order requires precedent to be established correctly. Azrael stopped walking. His hand, still holding mine, tightened just fractionally, just enough to be felt, and then deliberately, carefully relaxed. The specific control of a being managing something internal with the full force of thousands of years of practice. Define unmaking, I said. To the air. To the council's pervasive presence. To the gray light that had shifted slightly flatter at their arrival. A pause. The council did not typically address souls under review directly. I had established, over the last 23 days, that I was not a typical soul under review. The collector exists as a function of the order, said the voice. His consciousness, his continuity, his awareness, all of it is underwritten by the celestial framework. An unmaking does not destroy. It dissolves. Everything he is, every memory, every accumulated weight of every soul he has carried, a pause that might, in a human being, have been the search for a delicate word, every attachment formed in the execution of his duties. It returns to the framework. The function continues. The individual does not. I absorb this. The function continues. The individual does not. They would keep death. They would simply empty it. Take the thousands of years of accumulated consciousness, the weight of every ending carried, the descent written in 1887, the 10 years of a thread held with the specific care of something treated as precious. They would take all of it and pour it back into the machinery, and what would walk out on the other side would collect souls in close eyes and escort the dead with perfect efficiency, and it would have iron gray eyes and black hair and it would not know what a coffee cup meant when someone pushed one toward you. It would not know my name. No, I said. The soul does not have standing to. I don't care about standing. My voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very cold, the specific register I reached when I was past anger and into something more fundamental. You are describing the murder of a consciousness that has existed since the beginning of death itself. You are dressing it up in administrative language and calling it a consequence. It is not a consequence. It is a choice. And I want you to say that clearly. Another pause. Longer. It is the cost, said the council, of defying the order. It is the cost you decided to set, I said. Which means you can undecide it. We cannot. You mean you won't? Silence. The flat, enormous silence of an authority that has confused those two words for so long it has forgotten they are different. I turned to Azrael. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen before, not the composure, not the sorrow, not the warmth that had been growing since day one. Something underneath all of those. Something that had been there the whole time, at the very bottom, that I was only seeing now because everything else had been stripped back by the specific brutality of the last 10 minutes. He had known this. Before he broke through the membrane, before he pushed through the council's amber and came into the in-between and found me standing in the gray light with my arms lowered and my chin up, he had known exactly what the cost would be. He had come anyway. You knew, I said. Not an accusation. Just the fact, placed between us, needing to be acknowledged before we could move past it. Yes, he said. You knew they would unmake you and you came anyway. Yes. Azrael. His name in my mouth carried everything I didn't have a word for. That is, you cannot, I told you specifically not to spend yourself. You told me, he said, with a gentleness that hit somewhere behind my sternum, that my existence was not a currency. I agree with you. Which is why I didn't spend it. I chose with it. There is a difference. I stared at him. That is the most infuriating sentence anyone has ever said to me, I said. I suspected it might be. You don't get to reframe sacrificing yourself as simply making a choice. Every choice is a choice, he said. I have administered the end of more lives than you can count. I have watched more people weigh their options in the last moments of the last days than any other being in existence. I know what a choice looks like. I know what it costs. I know the difference between a choice made from desperation and a choice made from absolute clarity. He looked at me steadily. This was the second kind. The in-between was very quiet. 24 hours, said the council's voice, from the periphery of things. Reminding us. Marking the boundary. I looked at Azrael for a long moment, this being who had existed since the first death and had never once in all that time made a choice for himself, who had carried every ending and given none of them to himself, who had written a dissent for a woman he hadn't met and held a coffee cup he didn't need and broken through the amber of a direct council order because my thread was on the other side of it, and felt something solidify in me with the specific, irreversible quality of a decision made. All the way down. What do you remember? I asked. If they unmake you, what do you lose first? He considered this with the careful honesty he brought to everything. The recent memories dissolve first. The attachments formed in the final period of individual consciousness. A pause. You would be among the first things gone. Of course I would be. Of course they had designed it that way. And the descent? I asked. The 1887 descent. Would that go too? Everything individual goes, he said. The function retains only what it needs to operate. So they'd get to erase the only voice that ever argued against them from the inside. Yes. And they'd get to do it while calling it procedure. Yes. I let out a breath. Slow and controlled and containing approximately everything. Okay, I said. Okay, he repeated carefully. He knew my okays by now, knew the difference between the okay that meant I accept this and the okay that meant I have just decided something and reality should prepare itself accordingly. I am going to find the older law, I said. I am going to find it in the next 24 hours and I am going to use it to stop them from touching you. And then I am going to find a way out of my own contract that doesn't cost either of us anything else. And we are going to walk out of this in-between and back into Prague, and it is going to be November, and it is going to be cold, and the cobblestones are going to be wet, and I am going to make coffee. I stopped. Steadied. And you are going to hold the cup. Do you understand me? He looked at me for a long moment. In his eyes, iron gray and warm and ancient and completely, devastatingly present, I watched the last of the distance close. The final careful gap between what he was and what he felt, sealed shut by the specific gravity of this moment, this place, this woman who had just promised him coffee in the same breath as salvation and meant both with her entire self. I understand you, he said. Good. I looked around the gray expanse of the in-between. Now help me find a library. His expression did the thing, the shadow of amusement, the almost warmth, the fraction of something that in any other being I would have called a smile. In the in-between. There is always an archive, I said. You told me the order keeps records of everything. Everything means here too. There has to be something, some record of the law that existed before the council, before the framework, before all of it. Something they couldn't erase because they didn't write it. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he knew something. Azrael, I said. What do you know? There is, he said slowly, a place in the in-between where the oldest things are kept. Not kept by the council. Kept by the in-between itself. The sediment of everything that came before the order existed to file things correctly. He paused. I have never gone there. No collector has. It predates the function. Then it's not under their jurisdiction, I said. No, he said. It is not. Take me there. He looked at me, one long look, carrying everything. And then he turned and the gray light shifted around him like it recognized him, like even here in this pre-jurisdictional space the in-between knew what he was and made room for it. This way, he said. I followed him into the oldest part of what existed before everything, and behind us the council's 24-hour clock ran in silence, and I was already reading. The oldest part of the in-between looked like memory. Not a library. Not an archive in any sense I had a framework for, not shelves, not documents, not the sourceless gray light of the holding space we had been moving through. It looked like the inside of a moment that had refused to end, layered and translucent, the way light looks through deep water, the way very old glass distorts the view of what's behind it. Things existed here not as objects but as impressions. The sediment of everything that had come before the order existed to categorize it, compressed into something that was simultaneously nowhere and the oldest place in existence. I stood at the threshold and felt it the way you feel the change in air pressure when you enter a very old building, the specific weight of accumulated time pressing against your skin from every direction. This predates the council, I said. This predates everything the council considers foundational, Azrael said. He was standing beside me at the threshold, and even he, ancient beyond meaningful measure, existing since the first death, was looking at this place with the careful attention of someone encountering something older than themselves. The in-between existed before the order formalized it. Before collectors were appointed. Before contracts were written. Before the machinery of death was organized. A pause. This is what was here before the machinery. What was here before the machinery? I asked. Law, he said simply. Not the council's law. Not procedural law. The kind of law that exists because it is true, not because an authority decided it would be. The kind that doesn't require enforcement because it is woven into the nature of things. I looked at the layered translucent depths of the oldest place in existence and thought about the 1887 descent. A contract made in desperation is not a sale. It is a theft in the language of a transaction. Written by a being standing exactly where I was standing now, at the edge of what the order permitted, and pointing at something older and more fundamental that the council had no mechanism to erase because they hadn't written it and couldn't claim jurisdiction over what preceded them. How do I read it? I asked. You don't read it, he said. You remember it. This place operates on a different principle than the archive beneath Charles Bridge. The documents there were written by the order and can be read as documents. What is kept here was never written. It simply is. You have to be still enough to receive it. I looked at him. You're telling me to stop thinking. I'm telling you to think differently. For a being who has never broken a rule in thousands of years, you are remarkably good at saying things that sound like loopholes. The almost smile. Even here, even now. I learned from the best. I took a breath. Looked back at the layered depths. And did something that does not come naturally to a woman whose entire professional identity is built on precision and controlled output and the sharp deployment of exactly the right word at exactly the right moment. I went quiet. Not the quiet of waiting. Not the quiet of strategy. The actual quiet, the kind that requires setting down every tool you habitually carry and standing in a space without them and trusting that what needs to arrive will arrive without being forced. The kind of quiet I had last managed in a hospital corridor at 17 when I had exhausted every option and sat in the absence of them and simply asked. Something listened then. Something listened now. It arrived not as text, not as language, not as anything my translation skills could process in their usual manner, but as understanding, the way you understand a piece of music you have never heard before, the way you understand grief before you have a word for it. It settled into me layer by layer with the specific weight of something that had been waiting in this place since before the council convened its first session and decided it was in charge of how things ended. The law before the law was this. A soul is not a commodity. It is not a unit of exchange. It is not a thing that can be given, sold, or transferred, because it is not separate from the being who carries it. What is called a soul contract is, in the oldest understanding, a paradox, an attempt to legislate the transfer of something that by its fundamental nature cannot be separated from its source without the complete willing dissolution of the self. Therefore, no soul contract is valid unless the soul itself, not the person, not the frightened child in the corridor, not the desperate parent at the bedside, but the soul, in full knowledge of its own nature, chooses to release. A soul that does not know what it is cannot choose to release what it is. The contract is void. I opened my eyes. Azrael was watching me. He had been watching me the entire time. I could feel it, the specific quality of his attention that I had mapped over 23 days and could now identify with my eyes closed. And his expression was carrying something I recognized as the convergence of hope and terror, which is the expression of a being who wants something so completely that the wanting itself has become dangerous. It's not about informed consent, I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. It's deeper than that. The council argued my contract was valid because I signed it. Your 1887 dissent argued it was invalid because I didn't fully understand what I was signing. But the oldest law says both of those framings are wrong because they both treat the soul as a transferable object. I stopped. Steadied. A soul cannot be contracted because it cannot be separated. The entire framework is built on a premise that the oldest law says is a category error. Azrael was very still. If that's true, he said carefully, then it isn't just your contract that is void. It's the entire contractual framework, I said. Every soul contract ever written under the orders system. All of them predicated on the idea that a soul can be transferred, which the oldest law says is fundamentally impossible. I paused. The Council has been administering a system built on a legal fiction for thousands of years. The implications of this settled between us like snow, soft, irreversible, covering everything. They will not accept this quietly, Azrael said. No, I agreed. They won't. But they can't refute it either because they didn't write it, and they cannot claim it's wrong without admitting they know it's right. I looked at him steadily. This is what you take into the confrontation. Not a precedent. Not a dissent. Not a procedural argument. The foundational law that their entire system has been violating since it was established. He looked at me for a long moment. You understand what invoking this means? Not just for your contract. For the entire order. I understand, I said. The Council will fight it with everything they have. Let them. Nadia. My name in his mouth, the way he said it now, after everything, after the thread and the 3 words in the amber and the membrane and the 24-hour clock running on the other side of this place, carried more weight than any 3 syllables had a right to carry. Are you certain? I thought about my mother in Berlin, painting again, laughing at terrible television, alive for 10 years because 17-year-old me had tried to save her with the only thing she had. I thought about a dissent written in 1887 that no one listened to. I thought about a coffee cup held in hands that didn't need it. I thought about 3 words said in the dark and heard across a membrane that should have been impassable. I thought about a function that would continue without an individual inside it, collecting souls with perfect efficiency and iron-gray eyes that didn't know what they had lost. I have never been more certain of anything, I said, in my entire life. He held my gaze for one long moment. Then he did something he had not done in any of the 23 days before this one, not in the apartment, not in the archive, not in the in-between. He reached out, slowly, with that devastating deliberateness, and took my hand. Not covering mine. Not a gesture of comfort or steadiness or the management of proximity. Just taking it. The way you take something you have decided belongs with you. Then let's go end this, he said. I looked at our hands. Looked at him. Looked at the layered translucent depths of the oldest law receding behind us as we turned back toward the membrane, toward the Council, toward the confrontation that was going to rewrite the architecture of how death and souls and the space between them had been governed since before I was born. Together, I said. Together, he said. We walked back through the in-between, and the oldest law walked with us, and ahead the Council waited with their 24-hour clock and their institutional authority and their absolute certainty that they were the final word on how things ended. They were about to discover they were not even close to the first. We came back through the membrane together. Not the way Azrael had come through alone, not with effort, not with cost, not with the sensation of threads pulling loose from the weave of his being. We came through the way things come through when they are moving with the current of something older than the barrier itself. The membrane parted around us like it recognized what we were carrying and had the good sense to get out of the way. My apartment materialized around us, Prague, November, 3 a.m, the lights still out from when the Council had flattened them, the cold air carrying the faint smell of old stone and river water through the window Azrael had stood at on night 1 watching the city breathe in the dark. Kafka was still under the bed. The coffee cups from this morning, had it been this morning, had it been a century, had it been both simultaneously, were still on the counter. The Council was still here. 5 figures. Vast and sourceless and immovable in the center of my living room, their presence the way deep water is a presence, ambient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the specific smallness of whatever moves through it. The central figure's white empty gaze moved to us the moment we came through, to Azrael first, with the flat assessment of an authority recalibrating for a variable it had never had to account for, and then to me, with something that was not quite surprise but was the institutional equivalent of it. We had come back. Voluntarily. Into their jurisdiction. They had not expected that. Good. The 24 hours have not elapsed, said the central figure. No, I said. They haven't. We're not waiting for them. I stepped forward, specifically, not Azrael, because this argument was mine to open and he knew it and stayed one step behind me with the deliberate positioning of someone who understands the difference between support and interference. We're invoking the law before the law. The foundational principle that predates the celestial order, predates the contractual framework, predates every procedural mechanism you have used to administer death since you appointed yourselves its administrators. The council's atmospheric weight shifted. Not movement, they didn't move, but the pressure in the room changed the way pressure changes when something large and certain encounters something it cannot immediately categorize. There is no law before the order, said the central figure. There is, I said. You know there is. You built your entire framework on top of it and hoped no one would dig far enough down to find the foundation. The in-between keeps it. Not you, the in-between itself, which predates your jurisdiction and exists outside it and cannot be amended, struck from the record, or reclassified as an anomaly of sentiment. I held the central figure's white gaze without flinching. A soul is not a commodity. It cannot be transferred because it cannot be separated from its source. Every soul contract your order has ever written is built on the premise that it can be, which the oldest law says is a category error. My contract is not voidable on procedural grounds. It is void on foundational ones. It was never valid. Not because I didn't understand what I was signing. Because what I was signing described an impossibility. The silence that followed was the largest silence I had ever been inside. The council was not still. They had always been still. But the quality of their stillness changed, the way the quality of stillness in a very old building changes when something structural shifts inside the walls, imperceptible on the surface, seismic underneath. You cannot invoke the foundational principle, said the central figure, as a unilateral instrument. It requires a witness, said Azrael. He stepped forward beside me. Equal footing. The first time he had stood beside me rather than behind or between since we came back through the membrane, and the difference was everything, not protection, not positioning, not the careful management of proximity that we had both been practicing since day 3. Just beside. Just equal. Just here. The foundational principle requires a witness to its invocation, he said. A being of sufficient standing within the order to attest that the principle exists, that it was encountered in its original form, and that its conditions are met in the case under review. His iron-gray eyes, warm now, completely and irreversibly warm, and I understood that the council could see this and that it cost him nothing to let them, held the central figure's gaze with a steadiness that had the specific quality of something that has made its decision all the way down and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I am that witness. I attest to the existence of the foundational principle. I attest that Nadia Voss encountered it in its original form in the pre-jurisdictional space of the in-between. And I attest that its conditions are met. Her contract describes a transfer of something that by the foundational nature of what a soul is, cannot be transferred. The contract is void. The council's pressure intensified. The flat light they carried pressed into the corners of the room, into the ceiling, into the space between me and Azrael, as if trying to find a gap in what we had built and coming up empty. "The witness," said the central figure, "is compromised. His testimony cannot be considered impartial. He has formed an attachment to the soul under review." A pause designed to land like a verdict. "This disqualifies him." "On the contrary," I said. They both looked at me. "Under your own procedural rules, which I have had 23 days and one supernatural holding space to study extensively, a witness's testimony is disqualified only if the attachment was formed before the review period began. Azrael's," I paused over the word and then used it, deliberately, "without armor, because some words deserve to be said without armor, attachment formed during the 30-day courtesy period, which your own framework established and governed. You cannot use something that developed within your own sanctioned process to invalidate testimony about a principle that predates that process entirely." I looked at the central figure steadily. "You built a system with a contradiction inside it. We're not responsible for the contradiction. You are." Another silence. Different from the last one, tighter, more pressurized, the specific quality of an institutional authority encountering an argument it cannot procedurally defeat and understanding this for the first time. "If we accept the foundational principle as invoked," said the central figure, very carefully, "the implications extend beyond this single contract." "Yes," I said. "They do." "The entire contractual framework?" "Would require review," Azrael said. "Each case assessed individually against the foundational principle. Contracts that describe genuine willing release, made in full knowledge and full selfhood, may stand. Those that describe the transfer of something that cannot be transferred, and there are many, as you know, as you have always known, will be void." "This would restructure how the order operates," said the central figure. "Yes," I said. "It would. I'm a translator. Restructuring things so they say what they actually mean is what I do." I paused. "Your system has been saying one thing and meaning another for thousands of years. It's time for a better draft." The council was silent for a very long time. In that silence I was aware of everything: the cold November air, the coffee cups on the counter, Kafka under the bed, Azrael standing beside me with the thread warm and steady between us, the 24-hour clock running down somewhere in the celestial machinery, the cost still accumulating in him, slow and significant and something I was not going to let reach its conclusion. Then the central figure said something I had not anticipated. "There is a condition." I went very still. Beside me, Azrael went very still. "The foundational principle, if invoked and accepted, creates a vacancy," said the central figure. "The soul contracts that are voided leave gaps in the framework. The function of collection must continue, death does not pause for administrative restructuring. Someone must serve as the bridge between the old system and the restructured one. Between the foundational principle and the practical requirements of the order's continued operation." A pause that was longer and more deliberate than any that had come before it. A human interpreter. Someone who understands both the language of the order and the language of the foundational principle. Someone who has demonstrated the capacity to read far enough. I stared at the central figure. "You're offering me a job," I said. "We are describing a condition," said the central figure. "The foundational principle is accepted. Your contract is void. The framework enters review." Another pause. "In exchange, you serve as interpreter to the celestial order for a period to be determined. Working within the restructured framework." ensuring the new system reflects what it actually means. The room was absolutely silent. I turned to look at Azrael. He was looking at me, not with the careful distance of the first days, not with the managed composure of someone deciding how much to let through. Just looking. Fully. Everything visible. "This would keep you in the Order's world," he said quietly. "Adjacent to it. It would not be a human life, exactly. Not the life you had before." "No," I agreed. "You would be giving up." "I know what I would be giving up," I said. I held his gaze. "I also know what I would not be giving up." He understood. I could see him understand, could see it move through him the way understanding moves through a being built for it, settling into the deepest part of what he was with the specific weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being named correctly. "Nadia," he said. "Just my name. Containing everything." "I translate things," I said. "That's what I do. I find the precise word. I make sure things say what they mean." I looked at the council, at the 5 vast figures who had arrived in my apartment at 3 in the morning expecting to collect a soul and were leaving with a restructured framework and a human interpreter and the first institutional challenge to their authority since a dissent written in 1887 that no one had listened to. I looked back at Azrael. It turns out the most important translation I will ever do just happens to be in a celestial legal system. I paused. "Also, you will be there." The almost smile. The shadow of amusement. The thing that had been growing since day one into something that no longer needed to hide. "Also, I will be there," he said. "Then I accept the condition," I said to the council. The pressure in the room changed for the last time, releasing, gradually, the way pressure releases after a storm has broken, the flat council light warming fractionally back toward something livable. The central figure regarded me for a long moment with those white empty eyes that were, I realized, not empty at all. They were full, overfull, of the accumulated weight of every soul the Order had ever administered. And what lived in them was not indifference but the very old exhaustion of a system that had known for a long time that it needed to be different and had not known how to become so. "The ruling will be formalized," said the central figure. "At dawn." Then they were gone. All 5. The pressure lifted. The light normalized. The November air moved again in the way November air in Prague moves. Cold and old and carrying the smell of stone and river and the specific kind of quiet that belongs to a city that has survived everything it has ever been asked to survive. My apartment was just my apartment again. Kafka emerged from under the bed, walked to the center of the room, sat down, and stared at both of us with the specific judgment of a cat who has been extremely inconvenienced and intends to make this known. I laughed. It came out slightly wrong, too full, too relieved, too much of the last 23 days compressed into a single sound, and I let it, because some things are too large for composure and the armor was down and I had decided, somewhere in the in-between, that I was done maintaining it around him. Azrael looked at me laughing in the relieved broken way, and his expression did something it had never done in all the careful weeks before this moment. He smiled. Not the shadow. Not the almost. The actual thing, rare and devastating and worth every single one of the 2,000 days he'd been carrying my name waiting to arrive at it. Dawn was coming. The ruling would be formalized with it. Dawn in Prague arrives like a decision. Not dramatically, not with the gold and fire of cities that perform their mornings for tourists. Prague's dawn is quieter than that, more considered, the light arriving in slow increments through the November fog as if feeling its way carefully through something it has navigated 1,000 times and still finds worthy of attention. The cobblestones go from black to gray to the particular color of old silver. The Baroque rooftops emerge from the dark one by one. The river catches the first light and holds it without showing off. I had watched this dawn from my window more times than I could count in 3 years of living in this city. I had never watched it the way I watched it now, standing at the glass with a coffee cup warm in both hands, the city assembling itself out of the dark below me, everything that had happened in the last 23 days sitting inside my chest with the specific settled weight of things that have stopped being in motion and arrived at where they were always going. Azrael stood beside me at the window. Not behind me. Not at a careful managed distance. Beside me, close enough that the sleeve of his dark coat touched my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the deep slow pulse of whatever lived in him where a heartbeat would be in a human being, that ancient rhythm that had been going since the first death and would, thanks to the night we had just survived, continue going for considerably longer than the council had intended. The unmaking had stopped the moment the ruling was accepted. I had felt it stop, not physically, not in any way I could have explained to a doctor or a lawyer or anyone operating within the framework of the world I used to live in exclusively, but in the thread, the warm amber light of it running between us, steadying in my chest like a held breath finally released. The cost reversing. The loosened threads of him pulling back into place. He was whole. He was here. He was standing at my window watching Prague wake up, and his iron-gray eyes were warm, and the smile from last night, the real one, the actual thing, had not entirely left the corners of his mouth. I had been looking at those corners for 23 days, and I knew them very well. The formalization happens at sunrise, he said. Not anxious, just marking it. The habit of a being who had administered more dawns than I could count, for whom sunrise had always meant something transitioning from one state to another. I know, I said. After that the interpreter role becomes official. The order will have standing to call on you. It will not be a normal life, I said. I know. It will be complicated. Azrael. I turned to look at him. He turned to look at me. This close, in the gray pre-dawn light, with everything stripped back and the armor down and 23 days of accumulated knowing between us, his face was, I did not have a word for it in any of the languages I translated. Something that required a new word. Something that had not needed to exist before now because the thing it described had not existed before now. I translated shipping contracts between companies that hated each other in a city I chose because it smelled like old stone and suited my mood. My life was already complicated. It was just complicated in ways that didn't mean anything. I paused. I would like complicated that means something. He looked at me for a long moment. The dawn was coming, I could see it at the edges of the sky over the Baroque rooftops, the dark softening by degrees. Your mother, he said. She will have questions. My mother, I said, has been waiting for me to bring someone home since I was 22. She is going to have approximately 10,000 questions, and then she is going to offer him coffee and tell him he's too thin, which, I looked at him, the impossible height, the pale luminescence, the dark coat that absorbed light rather than reflected it, will be an interesting moment for everyone involved. The smile. The real one, again. Edges of it warm in the pre-dawn gray. I don't require sustenance, he said. You held the cup anyway, I said. Every time. Yes. Then you'll hold it at my mother's kitchen table in Berlin too. I looked back at the window. The city was almost fully assembled now, emerging from the dark piece by piece, stone by stone, the Charles Bridge visible in the distance over the river with its saints standing in the fog and the hidden door at its base that I would never walk past again without knowing what was underneath it. she's going to love you. She has terrible taste in television and excellent taste in people. It runs in the family." He was quiet for a moment. A different quiet from all his others, not the composure, not the management of distance, not the careful navigation of proximity. Just the quiet of someone sitting inside something good and letting it exist without immediately cataloging it as temporary. "Nadia," he said. "I know," I said. Before he could say the next thing, before he could find the precise words for what 10 years of carrying a thread and 23 days of a Prague apartment and one night in the in-between added up to, I said it first because I am a translator and finding the precise word is what I do. "I know. I do too." He turned to look at me. I turned to look at him. The dawn arrived, properly, finally, the first direct light breaking over the rooftops and coming through my drafty November window and settling across his face in a way that did something entirely unreasonable to the angles of him, catching in the iron gray of his eyes and turning them, for just a moment, the color of silver light on old water. He raised one hand, slowly, with that devastating deliberateness that I had mapped and memorized and would know in any register in any language in any dimension that turned out to exist, and touched my face. One hand, cupped against my jaw, his thumb at my cheekbone, the specific warmth of him that was not body heat exactly but something older and more constant. I leaned into it. Without calculation. Without armor. Without filing anything away for later. "The ruling is formalized," he said quietly, as the sunrise settled fully over Prague. I felt it, not just saw it, felt it, the shift in the thread between us, the celestial machinery turning over into its new configuration, my contract dissolving not with drama but with the quiet relief of a wrong thing finally being corrected. I was free. Not the way I had imagined freedom at 17 in a hospital corridor. Not the freedom of an unpaid debt, not the freedom of an escaped consequence. The freedom of something resolved, something that had been tangled and complicated and costly and was now, finally, simply, true. "Good," I said. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Now that the 30 days are done. Now that all of it is done. What do you want?" I thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long at all. "Coffee," I said. "First. Then I want to call my mother. Then I want to go to the archive beneath Charles Bridge and start reading the oldest law properly, because if I am going to interpret it for the celestial order I want to make sure I understand every clause." I paused. "And then, I don't know. Then we figure out what this looks like. Day by day. The way people figure things out when they have decided that figuring things out together is better than the alternative. People," he said carefully, with the specific precision of a being flagging a term that may not be entirely accurate. "People," I said firmly. "You held a coffee cup. You count." He looked at me for a long moment. This woman who had told the Celestial Council their framework was a category error and offered to fix the drafting, who had navigated the in-between on spite and legal instinct and the specific stubborn love of someone who had decided that his existence was not a currency and meant it with everything she had, and the expression on his face was the one from the archive, from the in-between, from the threshold of the oldest law. The one containing 10,000 years of solitude and one ending that turned out to be a beginning. "Coffee," he said. "Then your mother. Then the archive. Then the rest," I said. "Then the rest," he agreed. I turned from the window and went to the kitchen. He followed. Kafka emerged from wherever he had retreated to observe the proceedings with maximum judgment and minimal involvement, walked to his bowl, and declined to acknowledge either of us. I made 2 cups. The way I always made them, one for me, one pushed across the counter without ceremony, without explanation, the gesture that meant I see you here and I'm glad you're here in the only language I'd had for it before I learned to say it out loud. He picked it up. Both hands, the way he always held it, too still, too careful, too aware of the weight of something small. The steam rose between us in the November kitchen light. Outside, Prague carried on in the way Prague always carries on, with the long patience of a city that has survived everything asked of it and expects to survive considerably more. The tram bells rang. The cobblestones held their cold. The river moved under the bridge with its hidden door and its buried archive and its oldest law finally acknowledged after everything it had waded through to be found. I wrapped both hands around my cup. He held his. We stood in my kitchen in the early light of a November morning in a city that smelled like old stone and cold regret and had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be exactly where I was supposed to be. The angel of death drank his coffee. And for the first time in the entire length of his existence, he stayed.